After crazy days like this Friday, some of you may be thinking that individual stock picking isn't for you. We have stocks like Jpmorgan falling 3%, Caterpillar falling by over 4%, Apple falling by 3%. Days like today really bring out your conviction and how much you really believe in the companies that you're holding in. If you can't stomach a measly 3% drop, then you might not really understand the companies that you're holding. So picking individual stocks isn't for everybody. It takes a lot of time to research each individual company. Each company has their own individual risk, and if you don't fully understand what you're investing in, pullbacks like this can scare you out of some really great companies. For many people, diversified ETFs make days like Friday hurt way less. You can get the diversification of hundreds of companies all through one easy ticker. And there's tons of different ETFs to choose from, and there's many that are even specifically focused on dividend-paying companies. So here's my list of the top 4 dividend ETFs that you can buy today, along with one that I would recommend staying away from. But first, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot and it helps get these videos out to more people. First ETF for today is Vanguard's High Dividend Yield ETF, which trades under the ticker VYM. VYM is a very diversified ETF with over 400 individual holdings, and it tracks the FTSE High Dividend Yield Index. The top 10 holdings includes companies like Jpmorgan Chase, which represents 3.7% of the portfolio, Johnson & Johnson, which represents 3.1%, Home Depot, which represents 2.9%, and so on down the list. You can see the top 10 here. Because there's so many different holdings, no one company makes up more than 4% of the entire portfolio, so there's not too much individual risk from any one company going through a lot of trouble. So if Jpmorgan fell by 50%, you only lose about 1.5% of the entire value of the ETF. So you're very diversified against individual company risk with this ETF. It also has good diversity across many different sectors, with the 3 largest being financial services, consumer defensive, and healthcare. VYM focuses on equities, so there's not really any real estate companies in this, which means that all of the payouts that you get from this ETF are taxed as qualified dividends instead of as ordinary income, like the ones that REITs pay out. Looking at some more information about the ETF, we can see that they have a 0.06 expense ratio, which means for every $10,000 you have invested in this ETF, you would essentially be paying them $6 for this entire diversified portfolio. They currently have a dividend yield of about 2.7%. And if we switch to here, we can see that that dividend has been growing on average by about 6.7% year over year. And this is something you'll see with a lot of the dividend ETFs, is that the payments fluctuate from quarter to quarter. And that's just based on however much the companies inside the ETF pay out that quarter. VYM's largest payment is typically at the end of the year. So the one that gets declared in December should be the largest one this year. Overall, with VYM's large diversified portfolio, with companies spread out across 10 different sectors, I think it's a very good holding to add into most people's portfolio if they want some high dividend income right now. Next, we have iShares Core Dividend Growth ETF, trading under the ticker DGRO. DGRO has 393 holdings, with some of the largest being companies like Microsoft, Apple, Pfizer, Jpmorgan, Procter & Gamble, Home Depot, Johnson & Johnson, and the list continues. DGR's focus is on companies that not only pay a dividend, but have sustainable dividend growth. This is reflected in their dividend yield, which is currently sitting at 1.97%, but they also have a decent growth rate, which is about 10%. In terms of their diversification, they have a focus on financial services, technology, and healthcare, and looking at some of their key statistics, their expense ratio is at 0.08, so it's a little bit more expensive than VYM. It's $8 for every 10,000 compared to $6 for every 10,000. It's not too big of a difference. The next ETF that we have is Schwab's US Dividend Equity ETF, which trades under the ticker SCHD. SCHD has about 100 holdings and tracks the Dow Jones Dividend 100 Index. It's not as diversified as VYM since it only has 100 compared to VYM's 400, but it does have a ton of great companies inside. Looking at their top 10 holdings, they have some similar ones like Home Depot, but there's also some new ones like Broadcom, Pfizer, Merck, Pepsi, Texas Instruments, BlackRock, and the list goes on. We can also look at the sector diversification and see how it's different to VYM. They both had a higher focus on financial companies. They both represented a little over 20% of the entire portfolio, but SCHD has more focus on industrials and technology, which VYM lacked. SCHD also has a really low expense ratio like VYM, and it's currently sitting at 0.06%. The trailing dividend yield is sitting at 2.96%. Switching over to a dividend summary, we can see that that dividend has been growing by an average of 14.5% year over year. Just like with VYM, this dividend ETF has payments that fluctuate every single quarter. And also like VYM, the largest payment tends to be in the fourth quarter of the year. So this next upcoming payment, we're expecting to be somewhere between the 50 and 75 cent range. But just like VYM, I think SCHD would be a great addition to many people's portfolios. Again, if they're looking for dividend income now, and for some people who need it to grow over time, because it is growing by about 15% year over year, which is pretty impressive growth. Of the 3 dividend ETFs that I've gone through so far, I personally like SCHD the best because it has the best of both. It has a high starting yield at around 3%, and it also has a really high growth rate, which is about 14.5%. So it beats out DGRO in both its starting yield and its growth rate, and it beats out VYM in both of those aspects as well. I personally like the holdings better in SCHD because it has a lot of them that I don't personally own individually. Like I don't own Broadcom or Pfizer or Merck or Texas Instruments or BlackRock, but through this I get exposure to those companies as well. And the last of the ETFs that I'm going to be recommending is Jpmorgan's Equity Premium Income ETF, which sells covered calls in a range of different stocks that have higher volatility. There are more risks to the returns with this ETF, so in turn they pay a higher dividend, which is currently over 7%. Covered called ETFs also tend to not appreciate that much in price, so most of the returns that you can expect are from the dividend. If we look at its performance over the last year, it has done fairly well. It's gone up about 10%, but when we compare that to the rest of the market, it's obviously not nearly as good. The dividends that you'd get paid out from JEPI are also going to be taxed as ordinary income rather than as qualified dividends like the previous 3 ETFs were. So you'll have to pay more on taxes on this compared to the other 3, but because you get a higher return, it helps balance out that extra cost. This ETF is also actively managed, so that's why it has a higher expense ratio at 0.35%. So for every $10,000 you have invested with them, it costs you about $35 a year to do that. We can look at its holdings and we see that it has a lot of these things, which seem kind of weird. These are equity linked notes, and that's what they use to generate the income. And then they also have holdings in companies like Intuit, Microsoft, Accenture, and Google. This ETF is new. It was created on May 21st, 2020. So there isn't a long run history for us to look at to compare with other ETFs like this. If we just look at the year's performance between similar ETFs, JEPI has been doing pretty well. With JEPI's 1 year return of about 10%, we can compare that to QYLD, which is one that sells covered calls on the NASDAQ 100 stocks, and it has moved up 0.2% in the last year. This one has a higher dividend yield, so that helps balance that one out as well. And then it's had similar performance to XYLD, which sells covered calls on the S&P 500. JEPI also pays monthly dividends, so every single month you'll get one part of this 7.5% yield, where the last payment was 37 cents for the share. And this amount fluctuates every single month because it just depends on how well the managers with the ETF do and how much premium they make from the covered calls that they're selling. This ETF is really best for people who either just need to have more income because they're already retired, or if they just want to have extra income to bolster the amount of dividends that they get every single month. It's not really for someone who thinks that this is going to end up growing or doubling over time. Realistically, the share price isn't going to change that much, and the amount of dividends that you get paid probably isn't going to change that much. It's just going to have this consistent yield of about 7.5%. And finally, I have one ETF that I would recommend thinking twice about getting into. And this is PowerShares S&P 500 High Dividend Low Volatility ETF, which is SPHD. I am not a fan of this one. On paper, without looking too deep into what the entire ETF composes of, it might seem like it's a pretty good one to get into. It's got a pretty high starting yield at 4%. It has a decent expense ratio at 0.3%, and it's got a dividend that is continuing to grow over time, albeit pretty slowly. So why do I not want to recommend this ETF to people? It's because of what is in the ETF. First, there's Williams Companies, which is down over 7% in the year. They have a high starting dividend yield, but they have a negative 10% growth rate, and their payout ratio is still over 100%, and this is their largest holding. Next, there's PPL, which is a utility company that's down 14.5% over the last 5 years. They also have a very high starting yield at 5.9%, with a payout ratio at 143% and a 1.8% dividend growth rate. And another one of their holdings is AT&T, which is down 35% over the last 5 years. They have a slow dividend growth rate at 1.6%, and this is getting cut next year, even though they have a high starting yield at almost 8.6%. This isn't bad for all of these companies. Some of these are good. Like Pfizer's a really good company. Chevron has been doing very well. Altria Group has been doing well for people. It isn't all of their holdings, but they only have 50. And when a lot of things in their top 10s aren't doing well, and several of them are at risk of cutting their dividend because they're paying such a high amount of money every single quarter to pay for this dividend, and when they can't afford it, it's not sustainable. And we can see this with their dividend payments over the last 5 years. Around the beginning of this year, they started cutting their dividend, and it dropped almost 30% in a couple of months before starting to slowly climb back up. And the dividend has barely moved over the last 5 years. It's been pretty flat around 15 to 16 cents for like 3 years. And if we go over to its long-term time frame, it was paying 12 cents back in 2012. I think you'd be much better off putting this into something that is paying a decent yield, like SCHD, which is already paying a 3% yield, which is just a little bit lower than this one. And you get really good growth out of it. And you get invested into really good companies that have been growing year after year, instead of a bunch of ones that have been in decline and have been paying out too much money in dividends. I understand why this one seems like it would be a good idea, because you get a high yield, because you get monthly dividends, but the underlying holdings aren't the best ones that you could get out there right now. But that's all that I have for this week. Are there any ETFs in this list that you think are worth investing in? Or are there any that you think are even better than the ones that I have listed? I'm sure I've missed some great ones out there. Let me know what your favorite dividend ETFs are down below. But I want to thank everyone for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out a ton. And I will see you all next week. Bye.